daawadayaal aad baan idin salaamayaa kusoo dhawaada barnaamij gaar ah oo lagaga hadlayo doorashooyinka jamhuuriyadda Somaliland oo dalka boqortooyada Ingiriiska lagu soo bandhigay. Michael Wolf ayaana ka hadlaya, waxaana jeclahay inaan barnaamijka isla eegno sida iyo daawasho wacan.
It's of course important to note that the 31st of May elections passed peacefully, with voting taking place in most parts of Somaliland, and also that the results were largely accepted as credible by those in Somaliland and stakeholders outside. It's also a matter worthy of note that although the results saw opposition parties gain seats and key positions, they were accepted by the government. Those are important milestones. As with any election, however, there are things that could be done to improve the fairness and efficiency of electoral processes in the future. It was of course notable that while a member of the clan grouping often described as a minority was successful in winning a seat in Parliament. That was a first ever and therefore another significant milestone. The situation for women, though, marked a significant step backwards in most respects. Somaliland is now the only African parliament with no female members, and the number of women in local councils has also dropped to a mere 3. We also note an analysis from past elections and from our own in this election that the limitation of political parties to a maximum of 3 does not seem to have had the effect over time that was hoped, and we're well aware of the intentions in that regard, and make some comment on that in the report. Yet that limitation, which doesn't seem to fully achieve the results that were hoped for, does seriously constrain the ability of Somalilanders to exercise their constitutional rights of political participation. In addition to that, we note with concern the now enduring practice in which each election is delayed. This has affected every Somaliland election, but glaringly so in the 16-year period that has elapsed between the lower house elections in 2005 and these elections in 2021, where there should have been only a 5-year term. Overshooting a term by 11 years is not insignificant. This seriously undermines the ability of the electoral system to provide effective participation for Somalilanders. These are not trivial concerns, and we highlight a number of measures we believe in the report that may be helpful in addressing them, along with steps intended to address a wide range of other issues. I picked these 3 issues out of those covered in our report because we feel there are 3 that deserve particular priority. We've done our best in our recommendations to point to specific ways in which they might be addressed. We've tried with our recommendations to be as direct and constructive as possible. So we hope those recommendations are useful in taking forward a program that is designed to try and address some of the things which I think are, in most instances, widely discussion on what the best measures might be in practice. It's really crucial that solutions, including to the issue of the underrepresentation of women in politics, are Somaliland-led. They cannot be donor-led. They must be owned by Somalilanders. There must be solutions that are found from discussion within Somaliland if they are to achieve long-term and positive effect. I'm going to finish there, but I want to leave you with the thought that each of the 3 specific issues that I've just highlighted, and Mark and Sarah will highlight some more specific issues in a moment, but those 3 have now become entrenched over a lengthy period of time. While considerable efforts have been put into addressing each, for example, the proposed but never implemented quotas for women, it seems clear that a robust discussion is now needed as to what other steps might be taken to address each issue in a manner that advances Somaliland's electoral system. It's a measure of the health of any representative democracy, not just that elections take place, of course that's important, but that they happen on time, that the whole of the population is able to both vote and to stand for election, and that space is created within reasonable legal parameters for new parties to emerge and existing ones to consolidate their positions around policy and ideological platforms that offer genuine political choice to voters. I'm going to finish there and hand over to my colleagues for some more detailed comments. Thank you.
I'd like to give a brief overview of our assessment of the media in relation to the elections, as well as highlight some of the key recommendations that we've made in this area. I think, first of all, it's important to note that unlike longer term and larger election observation missions, we didn't carry out a comprehensive, quantitative monitoring on the social media. Instead, what we did was we spoke to journalists and editors about their ability to report on the elections. We discussed with media outlets and others the legal framework for the media in relation to the elections. We spoke with the three parties to seek their views on how they perceived the media covered their campaigns. We also tried to form a qualitative assessment of the campaign on social media platforms. So with this in mind, here are some of the key findings as far as the media in relation to the elections on the 31st of May was concerned. So given the wider context of the media environment in Somaliland, and noting that in the past, governments have closed media outlets and journalists have been arbitrarily arrested, it was extremely positive to hear from media that they were able to cover the electoral process. I'll start that again, sorry for the howl round. Given the wider context of the media environment in Somaliland, and noting that in the past, governments have closed media outlets and journalists have been arbitrarily arrested, it was extremely positive to hear from media that they were able to cover the electoral process without any obstruction or interference. In terms of access to information during the electoral process, some media mentioned that they thought that the NEC's communication with them was sometimes poor, with timely information not available. Second, in relation to the legal framework for the media, now the Constitution provides for freedom of expression, which is also guaranteed by the 2004 press law. However, as mentioned, although there were no restrictions on media outlets during the electoral process, authorities have previously used the penal code to detain journalists rather than deal with the alleged offences under the press law, in other words, the civil law of Somaliland. The editors and journalists told us of their concern that the use of the penal code can sometimes lead to self-censorship and stifle media freedom. Now, this is an aspect of the legal framework in relation to the media that we recommend is changed, and I'll come back to it when recommendations are looked at. During the election period, the media were also regulated by a media code of conduct. A decree from the Ministry of Information also obliged government-owned media to give equal space and time to the three parties' campaigns. However, a media monitoring committee that was supposed to be set up to monitor the campaign, and that comprised the Somaliland Journalists Association, the Women in Journalism Association, the NEC and the Ministry of Information, actually didn't get set up on time. But Soldier, the Somali Journalists Association, as you know, instead did its own monitoring, and its conclusions were positive, that the media covered the campaign sensibly and responsibly, with the three parties receiving equal coverage. On a very, very, very positive note, political parties, also all political parties, informed the mission that coverage by the state media was balanced. And this was particularly notable coming from one of the opposition parties. The governing party agreed with this assessment, but they noted their feeling that private media tended to be a little bit more critical of government actions. In terms of the private media, much of their coverage of the election was paid for content by candidates. However, this paid for content wasn't identified as paid for content, and this rather undermines the principle of transparency and can potentially mislead voters if they don't know what they're watching. Now on to disinformation and fake news. On a very positive note, disinformation and fake news was not a feature of these elections, which is an improvement on the 2017 election. and nor did we as a mission observe or... And now briefly, if I can, just on to 4 recommendations in relation to the media. Criminal offences in the penal code that affect the media and run contrary to freedom of expression guaranteed by the Constitution should be repealed. Defamation should be dealt with as a civil matter. The state-owned media, they've got a particular responsibility to provide equitable access to candidates and parties during an election campaign. It was done well this time round. We very much hope that during future elections, the next presidential election, there should be a continuation of the largely balanced and impartial coverage noticed in these elections, particularly given the advantages of incumbency. I mentioned page 4 political content on television especially. This needs to be properly labelled as such. It's the absence of information on who pays undermines transparency and citizens' rights to information. And finally, the Media Monitoring Committee, or whichever mechanism is foreseen in the Media Code of Conduct to look at the media during an election campaign, this needs to be appointed in a timely manner so that the Media Monitoring Committee can fulfil its duties. So I hope that's given a brief overview of our media findings. There's more in the report, but for now, very much like to hand the floor to Mark Stevens, who will talk about our key electoral, legal, and inclusion findings. Mark.
Thanks very much, Sarah. As Sarah said, my remit really was to look at the electoral framework, the role of the National Electoral Commission, and also I'll also give a brief overview of some of the findings from Election Day as well, which is always of great interest. I'll also reflect on the issues of gender, women's participation and inclusion more broadly, which actually our colleague Kate Sullivan was working on, but she can't be here this evening. I think I'd like to say at the beginning, when it comes to election observation, it can often sound as though it's some outsiders coming in and making a lot of criticisms of one's process, which I understand if it was my election, I could be a little bit defensive about that. But I want to stress what the spirit of it is. The spirit really is to have an independent, impartial mission, which offers an opinion, an assessment, but with the view of being very constructive, with the view of offering a whole series of recommendations. And I think the recommendations are the most important thing to come out really, and there's quite a large number in the report. And the idea is to be supportive and constructive, to say, well, we thought these were the areas where there were weaknesses or problems or challenges, and in our view, this is what might be done in order to make it better for the future. As Michael said about women's participation, but I think it goes for many issues, these need to be national-led in the responses. We're offering a general idea, but the actual solution should always come from within a country in order to take things forward. I'm offering this sort of assessment also about looking at international standards, but Somaliland has made a constitutional commitment to recognise and act in conformity with international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So basically we're offering an assessment of the framework and the process on the basis of relevant regional and international standards for elections. The first thing to say is that the consolidation of the election laws, and there are a number of them before, into a single general law for national elections was very helpful, and this is a very good basis to go forward. Unfortunately, it was passed relatively late, which led to some challenges, and there are also some notable gaps and weaknesses. But the very fact that this exists as a single coherent document enables, I think, for further review and amendment as you go forward. I think the issue of freedom of association and the right to be elected are important. Both are provided for in the laws and the constitutions, but the way they're operationalised with a limitation to just 3 political parties able to contest and a prohibition on independent candidates means that de facto those rights of freedom of association and right to be elected are undermined in reality, unfortunately. I think also linking political party representation to the results of local elections creates a complication and an unnecessary complication in the scheduling of future elections. I've worked on elections all over the world, and I was quite intrigued / surprised / shocked when I came across this formulation. It's interesting, but I think it creates a lot of problems and also restricts participation rights in reality. Also, the educational requirements for candidates is problematic. For the House of Representatives, one requires a high school diploma, and for local councils, one requires a university degree, which beyond an opinion about requiring education anyway, there's not even a logic to that formulation, so that was an interesting thing. The election campaign as well, the formal election campaign was just 6 days long, with each of the political parties being given 2 days each, which of course is not adequate in terms of a formal campaign. What did that mean? It meant a lot of campaigning, of course, took place well before this, so-called informal campaigning, but it means therefore that this is unregulated in any shape or form. So I think that the campaign, legal framework for the campaign is somewhat lacking. Michael's mentioned the historic failures to respect term limits, and it's also because the provisions in the Constitution for extending the term are quite vague and weak, so it's quite easy to do, is another problem. The final thing about the electoral system is the number of voters per region varies quite considerably. So this means that equal suffrage is not provided for. I think the seat allocation per region is unchanged since the 1960s, was some information I came across. So I think obviously they're rather out of date. In looking at the work of the National Election Commission, I think one should start this because it's only fair to note the series of immense challenges they faced. I did a little list here. The late passing of the law. At the end of the day, an election commission has to abide by the law when it organises elections, but because it was passed late, this created lots of challenges for them. The late nomination of the full commission membership, because I believe one of the political parties was quite late in nominating their representative. Continuing uncertainty over the electoral date. A series of holidays, including Ramadan, in the midst of the organisation and the election lead-up. And also, of course, COVID-19 and the impact of that in terms of organising staff and such things. These are massive challenges for any election commission trying to organise an election. The Election Commission was also responsible for a major voter registration drive, which was said to have the confidence of stakeholders. I think it's likely that many people who could be on the register were not captured. And I think the lack of an up-to-date census means nobody's really sure what the actual eligible electorate is, which is another problem. So I think that the holding of a census, it would greatly facilitate the electoral process as well. Also the fact that an electoral voter registration ideally should be a rolling registration. So it's always available, it's inclusive, and it's auditable as well. That would make it also very much more cost-effective going forward, as well as reliable for the Election Commission. The issue of voter eligibility, I mean, it's interesting that the age of eligibility in Somaliland is 15, which is a choice. But it's the fact that it's, well, when do you have to be 15 by? Is it the time of registration or is it the time of the election? And if it's deemed to be 15 by the time of registration, but the registration process takes place way before the election day, as happened before, it means there's lots of people who then became 15 who hadn't been registered because they weren't captured in that period. Although I will come on to the issue of underage voting later, so maybe there was a solution there, unfortunately. The Election Commission, although it faced many challenges and did many tasks very well, was quite poor on providing timely and effective communication with stakeholders, to the public and to political parties. And this includes on its voter education as well, which started very late in the process. We also noted that not all polling staff were trained, and also that the Election Commission, which has a role to monitor political party nominations in order to ensure compliance in the nomination procedures, it's not clear whether this was done by the Electoral Commission, because no information was available. We couldn't tell one way or the other, which is another issue of transparency and information transmission. Election day itself, as Michael said, was fairly, people seemed quite happy with it. It passed fairly peacefully. But I think a number of sort of problems and technical challenges were evident based on and reports we received. Firstly, voters found it hard to identify where they should vote in many cases, to identify the correct voting stream, which must have been very frustrating for them. Then once they did find their stream, I think there was quite a broad lack of understanding of voters as to how to complete the process. This was the first time that 2 elections were held at the first together, and also the voter education was quite late, which are 2 factors within that. We also noticed extremely high levels of assisted voting, so people claiming they needed assistance in voting or claimed to be illiterate and such things, particularly among women, but not exclusively. And that's rather a concern, the high level of assisted voting. And also for the polling staff, having a lot of trouble finding the names on the voter register, they didn't seem to quite understand, caused lots of delays and further frustration. So I think all round for voters, although it was calm, it was peaceful, and the election happened on time and everything, I think there were lots of frustrations for the electorate, generally speaking. I'll finish now with some comments about gender and inclusion, which our colleague Kate Sullivan was actually responsible for, but she can't be with us, but I pulled out some of the main findings. Michael's talked about the issue of women's participation, that this has been often talked about, but it hasn't actually led to any concrete measures or special measures in order to resolve that. In this instance, the government did waive the nomination fee for women and national minority candidates, which is very positive, although this came so late in the process, it may have been de facto not so helpful, but the fact that they did it was a good step. And we all know that political parties agreed informal quotas, that each party informally agreed to put up 6 women and 1 candidate from the national minorities. And they got a lot of publicity for this informal commitment, but then didn't actually adhere to it, unfortunately. Only one party, I was going to call it the UCID, but I understand it should be called, is it UID? UID? Yes. Very good, thank you. That was the only party which met the gender commitment, and only one party, Wadani, met the national minority commitment. So that wasn't really adhered to in the end. Out of the 246 candidates for the election, only 13, so 5% were female, although as Michael says, no, there's no single female representative in the Parliament or the Assembly. One of the obstacles, a number of obstacles, the requirements for a financial status and property ownership for candidacy are barriers to women's participation. But I would say probably the major participation is a lack of political will within the parties in order to put forward women as candidates. So we concluded that special measures are warranted in the Somaliland in line with the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which foresees special measures in order to enhance women's representation. International missions don't normally talk about changes to the electoral system. That's a national issue very much. But if it is ever discussed and solutions are sort of looked for, then the closed list system as opposed to the open list system might help facilitate women's participation, and parties could put forward women candidates. The final points I'll mention about persons with disability. There were lots of reports we received from civil society and others that persons with disability face quite a lot of barriers in registering to vote and on election day because of problems of physical access to the premises where registration and voting was taking place. There's also barriers to political participation of persons with disability, particularly given the sort of prohibition on candidacy for persons with a mental or physical disability, which is incompatible with international standards. So as I say, the report which we've issued goes over all these issues in quite some detail, and also offers a whole series of recommendations in order to try and address them. But at the end of the day, these are just recommendations, and this is a debate and a conversation which Somaliland needs to have going forward on the various issues. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark and Michael. First of all, apologies to those of us who are trying to join us from Hargeisa and elsewhere. I think you've been able to see the auditorium, but unfortunately, due to technical issues, I think we only just managed to get sound. I do hope you've got sound now. I'd like to open the floor up to any questions here in the auditorium or comments that you might like to make. And for those joining us, I should say, on Zoom. If you can hear me, please do ask a question or make a comment using the Q&A function on Zoom. It would be great if you could also, whether you're here or on Zoom, let us have your name and your affiliation or organisation. But I'll start with here in London in the auditorium and open the floor up to questions or comments. There will be a microphone coming round, although we're small in numbers, we may not need it. Are there any questions or comments?
Who's going to be first?
I will be. And the reason is because you just mentioned several times that women participation and the lack of support in Somaliland, whether the politicians or the community. And basically you mentioned that the in relation to promote political platforms in women participation it has to come from Somaliland. I just try to make a comment. My communities, Somaliland community has been in very difficult situations for so many years. And the knowledge of women ability focus on their daily life in terms of families and their children and their schooling and kind of things. I think timing of having a time to run for or take part of the politician in Somaliland is not an easy task for women. Basically because they have lots of other things that they think about. And in terms of promotion, now in the hierarchy departments of politicians, there's no women. There's something they call there are like 10 male lining up. So there's no way that the woman shows their ability to participate or to be responsible or represent part of the community. So I'm not sure whether the chairs and the president of Somaliland are willing to engage women in politics without running for parliament or running for the local election. I think it's maybe a good idea to make a woman in the platform first, and then people can learn the Somaliland women's ability in political issue and solving problems. And I'm sure there's lots and lots of women that can be more active and more engaged in society in Somaliland. But as long as there's no even thinking about given an opportunity to get there, is that likely it's going to be there, and Somaliland is going to lack the ability. People wanted to promote and to emphasize their ability to put into the country, but there is no chance for them to be. So I don't know if there's nothing there, then I don't know whether I don't think they're going to engage themselves and organize and party for women. I don't think that's going to happen because there's no resources for that. So it's just a worry.
That's up to you if you want to take that and how you want to answer it.
I mean, and Mark, I think you probably have a few comments as well. I mean, it is a really, really difficult issue. I mean, from my perspective, it seems very obvious that you can't call an election a popular election if 50% of the population is not represented amongst the candidates who are standing. So that underlines the urgency of it. It doesn't give us an answer. The fact that there have been repeated attempts to introduce quotas, and they have failed. Even the attempt to introduce only a 10% quota ended up failing because of the problems of working out where those seats how those seats would be created, whether they're additional or whether they take away seats from existing male politicians. So there are clearly significant issues. The issues that you raised about having the ability, the space, the time, the money also to campaign are also significant. Although there were women candidates who were seemed very credible in their campaigns in this election. So it's, even with all those issues there, it was disappointing not to see any of them succeed. So I think there are a lot of different elements to this. One of the issues, I think we talked about it, I know we talked about it here, is the issue of the way that the open list system makes it quite hard to implement quotas, for example. And that's one of the things that I think I think there are a number of reasons why an open list probably exacerbates the male domination of politics, and also the segmentation of politics into existing non-policy based groups. And I would suggest that one of the things that needs to be looked at is that issue of open lists. Mark will probably have a lot more on that and knows a lot more about it than I do from an electoral point of view broadly.
Thanks. I mean, all electoral systems have advantages and disadvantages. There's no electoral system is a golden bullet to solve a country's problems. And even if you bring an electoral system to try and address one set of issues, you then open the door up to another set of problems. So usually it's an ongoing debate around electoral systems. But for sure, when it comes to the issue of women's participation all over the world, when you look at the electoral system, it is the closed list systems with an explicit quota built in them, which is the most effective for women's participation. Of course, it's not the only issue of consideration, but that's why it has to be a national discussion. But I think that because it's so hard for women to get started, to get those first steps, which is exactly why the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, foresees special measures. It's in order to create a presence and a momentum for women's participation, where for whatever reason, be it because of social or because of economic or political factors, that presence is not evident. So therefore, they recognise that special measures may be required. Now, what level of representation you provide for, to go from 0 to 50% might sound good, but might be quite ambitious. Other countries have gone for 10%, 20, 30%, or whatever. Again, that's something that would have to be a national discussion. But for sure, special measures are very valid. They're foreseen in international standards as a useful tool for promoting women's participation, which, as Michael says, is a very legitimate thing to achieve. And the electoral system can be amended in order to accommodate that, if you decide that's the way you want to go.
Thank you, Mark and Michael. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, for me and Mr. Michael Wallace, as you mentioned here, you did say it's a serious democratic deficit because women was not been elected in the last election, and the other words that you have used is making a step backwards from the past. I'm very sorry to use these words because in our constitution says every person in the country he can vote for and he can be voted for. So as long as that is existing, women are participating in the election, and it's the choice of the people. There was a free, fair election. As long as there is a free and fair election, it's the choice of the people. Because democracy, you have to be free. We did not force it, some people, or we did not, the voters, we did not force it, not for the women.
Sure.
So as long as there is a freedom of election, and it was a free, fair, it's the choice of the people. Because my constituency, there were some women who were candidates, Amina, and they voted for me instead of for her. So as long as there is a freedom, then...
That's not freedom though.
Let me just say, every people, every society in the world have got a culture. we do have some cultures that some restrictions. That's our culture, but our choice that was free. Even in the United States, it never ever been elected a woman in the president, and now it was the first time in the history of USA being elected a woman vice president. We did not say before it was a serious deficit. So our people, they might in later on, because we've been using this system for the past 19 years. So after 20 years, maybe some of our society might choose that or might elect a woman. But
waa tahay daawadayaal waxa aan hadda ka soo baxay qaybtii lagu soo bandhigayay waxyaabihii lagu arkay doorashooyinka Jamhuuriyadda Somaliland halkaas oo aan ku sugannahay jaamacadda University of London. haddaba daawadayaal haddii aan idin yar brief gareeyo amaba waxyaabihii goobta lagaga hadlay aan idin yar sharaxo horta doorashooyinkii Somaliland ka dhacay ayaa maanta lagu soo bandhigay waxyaabihii marka loo baahnaa in wax laga qabto sida ay sheegeen khubarada oo uu hogaaminayo Michael World. haddaba kulankan oo imika adigu su'aalihii iyo jawaabihii la isweydiinayo ayaa nuxurkiisu waxa uu ahaa in dawladda Ingiriiska iyo runtii dawladda Ingiriiska ay u qaabilsanaayeen in ay bal doorashada Somaliland ay observation ay ku soo sameeyaan. waxyaabihii haddaba ay halkan ay maanta ay ka sheegeen ayaa waxa ka mid ahaa waxyaabaha loo baahan yahay in wax laga qabto. waxyaabaha aad ugu nuxnuxsadeen waxa ka mid ahaa in ay doorashadani ay sababtay in aan dumar fara badan aan ugu soo bixin. runtiina waxay noqonaysaa mararka qaar dalalka westernku waxyaabaha ay aad u eegaan runtiina dhaliilaha ay xoog saarayeen. waxa ay yiraahdeen waa in waxa ka maqnay doorashadan in baarlamaanka Somaliland laga waayo dumarkii taasna macnaheedu ay xagal daacis ay ku tahay doorashooyinkii ka dhacay Somaliland ay yiraahdeen. waxa kale oo ay iyagana ay xoog saareen oo ay sheegeen oo ay sida ay iyagu marka ay waxyaabaha ay sheegayaan kamid aha in xagga saxaafadda oo kale dib u dhac far badan uu jiray walow warbaahinta qaranka loo qaybiyay ay yiraahdeen mucaarad iyo maxaafid. waxyaabaha dhaliisha badan ay ku sameeyeen waxa kamid ah dadka curyaamada dadka naafada ah in aanay helin hab wanaagsan oo ay u codeeyaan taasoo ay sheegeen doorashooyinka soo socda in looga faa'iideeyo isla markaana la abuuro jawi ay qof walba ku codeyn karaan. dooddu marka imka waxay u badan tahay guud ahaan waxay yiraahdeen doorashadii Somaliland ka dhacday waxay ahayd mid si sax ah oo xor ah oo xalaal u dhacday aadna u hambalyeeyeen laakiin waxyaabaha duruufaha iyo waxyaabaha dib u dhaca keenay ay xoog saareen inay goobtan ay ku soo bandhigaan magaalada London. reportkana waxa loo gudbinayaa dawladda dalka boqortooyada Ingiriiska oo ah dawladdii xornimada siisay dalka Jamhuuriyadda Somaliland. qodobka haddaba hadii gol westernku ay ku doodaan waxa kamid ah in aan dumarku aanay doorashada ku soo bixin. dooddu imika way bilaabmatay iyagu marka waxa ay leeyihiin waa in ay jiraan waxyaabo fara badan oo dumarka u sahlaya in ay ka qayb qaataan doorashooyinka. waxa ay dhaliileen oo yiraahdeen xisbiyada qaranku ma xoog saarin in ay dumarku ay soo baxaan. geesta kale waxa ay sheegeen in duruufo dhaqaale oo fara badan oo jiray la fahamtooda xagga dumarku ay ku hadheen. si kastaba ahaatee dooda qiimaha badan ayaa lagu soo bandhigay magaalada London. doorashooyinkii 31 May ka dhacay waa risalkii rasmiga ahaa ee loo gudbinayay baarlamaanka waddanka Ingiriiska iyo dawladda waddanka Ingiriiska. waxaan idin leeyahay inta aynu aragti noocan oo kale hawada ku kulmayno sida iyo nabadgelyo. Assalaamu calaykum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala.